Hello, everyone. Welcome to Virtual Vital City 2020. My name is Ken Lima Coelho. I'm a Calgary Foundation volunteer for many years, and I'm the Vice President of Community Engagement at the YMCA, where I find myself today. I'm at the Brookfield Residential YMCA in the Southeast. This is the largest YMCA anywhere in the world. Right through that window is a beautiful swimming pool. Right out that door, there'll be a fitness class that maybe I should have taken because this blazer I haven't worn in a while feels a little different. And of course, there's the banner that acknowledges our support of the arts. It is absolutely my pleasure to be your MC and moderator today. Sure, it's not our normal time. We're a bit earlier than we usually do Vital City, and it's certainly not our normal place. But one thing that will never change in our new normal world is our need to come together in whatever way possible to share our stories, show our compassion, and discover new ways to keep connected to bring about change for the benefit of everyone in our community. And of course, in our community, we are all treaty people. So to begin our event, it is my honor and privilege to introduce the always eloquent Elder Casey, Eagle Speaker, for a land acknowledgement and blessing. Welcome, Casey.
Okay. I am quite honored to be here to open it up with a blessing. I'm a member of the Kainai Nation, part of Black Confederation. I am known as Sorrel Horse. My given name is Casey Eagle Speaker. And looking at where we're at today in pandemic, I can't count how many Zoom meetings I've been to. I quit counting after the first couple of hundred. But I'll be doing my blessing in Blackfoot, praying for your families as well as others. And that the medical field will find the right vaccine that will come their way. We call upon the Creator for a lot of help. But for you especially, with Calgary Foundation, all the work you do, that you and yourselves and your co-workers will be kept safe. Pray for our sick ones, young and old. I do have to leave right after I get done. I got to zoom back into another meeting. So I apologize for that. I wish I could be here for the whole session. So just want to join me in a quick prayer. Ayo na pi na tus. Ayo ku kimiki smak. Ipaswats patsu paswats. Ay na itit pi okhitai na psko ko ka. O kispat pi pa na kukhtu kina okisikoy ka. Kasa pa na moksikuku siksaki. Ne akpai pi okka kispat pi pa. It's sipak so ma pi okka ki akpai pi masaka. Ru tsakatu sak. Okay, kimat do kena spat pio pa ken ikay dapat skits na nakana suka pio ka. Au kata pe kimang sa sakina sa kik sak. Okay, am kistis ma pio ka aksud stop aksud dap pio ka. Yang sa aksi po expert pio pa. Akto kam stop ka akto te pe skitsep po ka. Okay, kimat do spat pio pa. Akto man stop sak. Okay, no skap sa pa spat pio pa. Aksud sikikan kistikoy ka magsap pisik. Supermat bisika. Oh, kakam rakun ukun sko kaki. Kena pesta moksukoi kang sa bo makaik saksud sigaks agtataka besak. Oh, paper mokus system up yo kaki. And kesu kini kut dates mak kun masam kaki. Oh, kan sa peno kres betro kaki. Ats keki matap spin of cheta pisan. I guess kan skut up betro kaki. And akdep sa sopan okiskoi katsemu ikana. Aku tu sebut tata. Okay, kimat tu kinana. Okay, nak kau sistem apa sih? Buka, aku mesti buka ke setepik substansi taskin kau. Aksi yang kena sistem ke sepatu. Okay, kimat tak kena sepatu. Aku tak mana natu satu perskau semua penaku sengsa pokok tu penana. Okay, kau kena piu kipois kum sana. Kamu tak kaki sampai pada pisin kimat pisin. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. We always appreciate your eloquence and your beautiful and inspiring words. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, so you can translate that now too. So
it will be my pleasure, but I'll need some lessons. I'll book you for next Thursday. Thanks again, Casey.
You guys have a good day. Have a good meeting.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
All right. It has been said, ladies and gentlemen, that truth leads to freedom and silencing the truth leads to oppression. While the recognition of the role that race, racism, and unconscious bias play cannot happen without having honest conversations like the ones we're going to have today with an outstanding panel of leaders. I'll be introducing that panel for today's conversation shortly. But first, let's talk about 2020. What a year it has been, a year like no other. And to fill us in on the many activities of the Calgary Foundation, and boy, has our community foundation really stepped up in its 65th year. Eva Friesen will soon be here to talk about that and present her always colorful commentary. But first, for an overview of how the foundation has really stepped up to serve the community needs during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's my pleasure to introduce the Calgary Foundation's board chair, a very busy lady that is very, very committed to the foundation. Her name is Elizabeth Peters. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi. Hi, Ken.
It's great to have you. Thank you very much for doing this.
Well, thank you, Ken, for that kind introduction. It is my great privilege today as board chair and on behalf of my fellow directors at the Calgary Foundation to welcome all of you who are joining us today for the virtual Vital City event. And as adept as we have all become at technological gatherings these past 7 months, I must say that I am very much missing the buzz and the vibe of seeing you all face to face at the cocktail gathering in the BMO Center lobby, which is where we should be right now. As we cannot even bump elbows, let me take this opportunity to acknowledge all of you in our community, the charities, the not-for-profits, the donors, and the Calgary Foundation volunteers and staff for the tireless, committed work in serving our city through this pandemic crisis. Before I begin my report, I would like to share a teaching with all of you that originates from the Indigenous worldview. And through my learnings related to reconciliation, the legend of the buffalo is one that has always resonated with me. It's given me perspective in times of difficulty, and I feel it is so relevant in today's world of social and economic hardship. As many of you know, in Indigenous culture, the buffalo is a symbol of strength and bravery, and an animal that turns to face the storm rather than run from it. And more, the buffalo is revered as a teacher of self-respect, of community relationship, and how we relate to one another as kin. So for all of us, living in the coronavirus has been a challenge like no other, and I believe that the legend of the buffalo can inspire us to find toughness of spirit, to face this storm, and be reminded, particularly in the stresses of our current time, that we need to be intentional to foster kindness, respect, and understanding with one another. So I hope you find this sentiment echoing in my report to you on the Calgary Foundation response to the pandemic. On March 15th, the city of Calgary declared a state of emergency due to COVID-19. But despite the lockdown, our board meeting scheduled for March 19th went ahead as scheduled, and the board of directors and the staff convened on Zoom for the first time at this very critical moment of crisis, and we were able to quickly determine a course of action in response to the pandemic. On this first slide, you will see that the thing the Calgary Foundation did immediately was launch a charity needs page. This was on our website where charities could post their urgent needs for funding in order to inform and connect with donors directly. Secondly, the Pandemic Relief Recovery Program was formulated. This program envisioned a 3-stage process. Phase 1 was recovery, phase 2, re-entry and rebuilding, and phase 3 was resilience. Phase 1 began immediately, and the initial proposals were reviewed and funded within the first few weeks of the lockdown. And between April and August, the foundation has redirected resources from the regular granting streams and from government programs to the urgent needs in community and provided $7.8 million to 200 charities. This amount, combined with donor funds, provided $23 million of funding to the charitable sector, more than double the pace of funding for the same period in the prior year. In addition to these granting streams, the Calgary Foundation also participated in new collaborations with other organizations. We provided $1 million to the COVID-19 Community Relief Fund in collaboration with the City of Calgary, the United Way, and the Calgary Management Agency to meet the needs specific to social services. We also contributed $200,000 to the Rosa Foundation to assist with needs in the arts sector, one that was decimated by the pandemic due to the cancellation of all productions. We also participated through Community Foundations of Canada, the United Way, and the Red Cross in the Federal Emergency Support Fund, which enabled us to allocate $2.3 million to agencies in Calgary, providing services to the urgent needs in the city. So this phase of funding activities concluded in late July, and now the foundation is embarking on phase 2 of the pandemic recovery program. In this phase, we will be allocating $5 million of unrestricted granting to assist not-for-profits. We performed an extensive survey and asked charities specifically what their great needs were in this next phase. These criteria reflect what they told us: operational expenses, programming initiatives, capacity building, and capital upgrades. Phase 3 will commence in the new year, and so you will have to wait for Vital City 2021 to hear that report, and at which time I hope that we will be gathered again under one roof. That concludes my report. But in parting, let me say that most of us, probably all of us, have experienced moments of frustration during this pandemic, something I call the COVID crankies. So may the following clip inspire you, as it did me, to appreciate the things that continue to happen in our community during the pandemic. Thank you.
Definitely different times for us here at Owatown. Social isolation is a huge barrier during COVID. With this grant dollars, we were able to purchase PPE equipment for our families. And we were able to purchase cleaning supplies to make sure that when we delivered these COVID hampers, not only are families getting, formula, diapers, and nutritious food, but they're also receiving safety equipment through cleaning supplies and PPE. So we serviced over 1,000 individuals through the Calgary Foundation with the help with those expenditures.
We're very aware of the isolation and loneliness that seniors face. We just want them to know that we haven't forgotten about them. We still care about them. We started looking at what can we do. So we know we can't bring seniors out here. We came up with the idea of these window visits. Calgary Foundation contacted me and said, we actually think that you would fall under this COVID relief grant, especially because what you're doing is providing relief from isolation and loneliness. The reaction has been great. There's a woman who started coming outside the door. She was just loving it.
Our art project is called We Are Connected.
Our community members, it's been a tough time for them with COVID. We just haven't had the funds in our own community to fundraise. We can't get out there. It's very difficult to host events. And to have this funding has made it possible to have this event and do something for the community so they can get together and celebrate and feel connected.
This is a breath of fresh air, even if you have to wear a mask.
It all started with a Facebook post. Maybe it's a good idea to encourage all our alumni to write about how they're going through this crisis. So we applied for this Community Foundation emergency funding to build a collection of 20 stories written by newcomer women. We will publish their stories, give them an opportunity to express themselves, to share their voice.
It's with the support of sponsors like Calgary Foundation that make this possible.
I think we all want to feel safe and secure. I don't know that we would have been able to do this without that grant, to be honest.
Without that additional funding support, we wouldn't have been able to reach the number of families we reached.
You can see that what you're doing for them really changed their life.
Community is a very important aspect of who we are as human beings.
executives and the foundation, led to some really great grants, led to some amazing impact, led to those cute little horses. Oh, the horses alone. Thank you very much to Elizabeth Peters from the board. I just wanted to raise one thing. In this virtual world, there's always one surprise. And here was our surprise. When our wonderful elder, Casey Eagle Speaker, was giving his blessing in Blackfoot, the translation function, the AI, did something, I don't even know what happened there, but I'd like to apologize to Casey for whatever that was that flashed up on your continuous and simultaneous closed captioning. I don't know. It's just one of those virtual things. Let's go. It's all about pivoting. It's all about adapting. And who knows that better than my next guest? Eva Friesen is the president and CEO of the Calgary Foundation. She has been in the role for many years, seen all sorts of ups and downs in our community, and leads her team undaunted. She's here now to share what's been going on at the foundation in this most interesting of last years. Hi, Eva.
Hi, Ken, and thanks so much for that introduction. Ken, you said earlier in your opening remarks, we're all treaty people. So let me say, I was born and spent the first 24 years of my life in Treaty 1 territory, where the Assiniboine and the Red Rivers meet. Then I moved to work and play and live in Treaty 11 territory and spent 6 years there. 30 years ago, I came to Treaty 7 territory and put down my roots, put them down deep, here where the Elbow and the Bow Rivers meet. And although those treaties were in existence long before I was born, it's only been in about the last 5 or so years that they've registered in my awareness as a part of my story of where I come from. I want to thank Elizabeth Peters, our board chair, and the entire board for their tremendous governance leadership during this challenging time. Being on a board is always important, and it's always challenging, but never has it been more challenging as we navigated all the challenges of COVID and pivoted in the way we've done. And they have just done a tremendous amount of work in the last 7 months for sure. And I just want to recognize and thank you, Elizabeth, for your leadership, and thank all of our board. I want to particularly recognize our outgoing board members who completed their terms this year. We say goodbye, and we will certainly miss Greg Lonis, Patty Pond, Kay Best, and Sean Matthews. And at the same time this year, we welcome 2 new board members, and we are delighted to have you, Norman Ishmael Tija and Denise Bright. Now, my report to community is going to cover 3 things. I'm going to talk about our performance metrics. That's always what I cover. And then I'll talk briefly about some highlights from vital signs. And lastly, I'll bridge to the panel, which of course is the main function here today. So starting with our metrics. This past year, we achieved $35 million in new gifts. Now, one of our purposes is to inspire philanthropy. And this is what was inspired in the past year. Now, recognize and remember that we certainly had a low oil price year for the whole year. COVID just hit us in March, and our year end is March 31st. Now, we typically are giving through estates, makes up 10 to 30% of that in any kind of year. This year in particular, it was 25% of that gift. We don't fundraise, and so we don't set any targets. However, we do measure trends. And in the last 4 years, our gifts received typically are 25 to 64 million. And that very high year was a very large gift through an estate. So that is how we've done. Despite the depressed economy and the pandemic, Calgarians remain generous. We thank you. Your help is needed now more than ever. We've achieved 63 new funds established last year. And new funds are established, either future funds, and in fact, many of these were future funds last year. Our range of number of gifts in the past 4 years has been 47 to 63. So this is a high year. Probably it's high because we had many future funds. Future funds is people doing estate planning and thinking about their future and what they want to leave, their legacy they want to leave in community. There's likely a variety of factors. People had time to think about their legacy because they were spending a lot of time at home, or perhaps the global health crisis prompted them to think about their future. So we did a good job in future funds and in many other funds. And I want to recognize the hard work of our donor relations staff team led by Janine Webb and the commitment and leadership of our Professional Advisors Committee, chaired by our board member, Jim Brownlee. You are truly valued by the donor community in Calgary. Another metric we measure is our asset base. Despite the market decline that took place in March with the COVID-19 pandemic, our assets were still $1 billion at the end of March, our fiscal year end. After that time, they dropped a bit, as you can imagine, and they've come up a bit. And today, we are still at the billion-dollar marks. We're very pleased about that. We continue in a period of volatility, and like all of you, we cut back on our costs to operate just as we stood by and we're ready for whatever might happen. Now, this size of organization requires a lot of attention from good finance people. And I want to thank our very capable finance staff group led by Craig March for the very excellent work that you do. And I want to thank our audit committee chaired by board member Bill Sherman for the great oversight that they provide. It is that asset base that enables us to make grants to the community. And last year we granted 54.9, just about $55 million to the community, to 996 organizations. And that is, in fact, our second purpose for existing, is to support the charitable sector. And we do that primarily through grants. The total grants since the Calgary Foundation was born now equals $666 million to community. Grants range in size from $55 to $5 million. And whether big or small, each grant makes a difference. In fact, some of our smaller grants make an even bigger impact than the big grants. And we celebrated those, in fact, last year at Vital City. Many of you were there at BMO Center when we celebrated the 20th anniversary of our neighbor grants and grassroots grant making programs. Now, few people have worked as hard as Jason Bates and our grants team led by Jason over the last 7 months. I mean, they have put out grants like never before. So thank you, Jason and team, for your hard work. The 80+ granting committee volunteers led by board member and grants chair Murray Lafferty have ensured that we stay connected to the community that we serve, and they provide immeasurable value to our grant making. Hats off to all of you. In addition to grants, Calgary Foundation supports capacity building in the charitable sector in many ways, like facilitating learning, collaborations, partnerships, and providing tools to assess strategy and sustainability. We are the only community foundation across Canada to devote senior staff resources to that work. Often this non-grant support is even more important than the grants, and it's been of particular value during the pandemic, helping organizations navigate the challenges. Thanks to our staff team led by Allison Schultz for all their work in this area. Our business model is based on a very simple formula. We need to achieve a market return of 7% so that we can grant 4%, recover costs of 1%, and return 2% to the fund to keep pace with inflation. Although we monitor the short-term returns, it's the 10-year return that matters the most to us. You can see here that our short-term return for 1 year falls very far short of our 7% target. However, the 10-year return exceeds our target, achieving 8.22%. Both long and short-term returns exceed the benchmark. And I want to thank our investment committee, chaired by board member Blaine Lennox, and our investment staff team led by Dan Langlois for their hard work and leadership during these challenging times. 19 fund managers invest our endowment. Overseeing that activity would not be possible without the incredible effort of those people. Now, just 3 years ago, we added impact investing as a program. And since doing that, we have supported 13 organizations with $21.4 million in loans. Total loans repaid since inception is total loans since inception is 21.4 million. The total loans repaid is 9.5 million, and this includes 3 fully repaid loans. The total active loans out at present is 12.5 million, working in 10 organizations. And our returns since the beginning is 2.7%. Now, 3 years ago, when this started, $20 million was assigned to this program from an anonymous donor. Recycling of that fund started just last year. 1.4 million has been recycled to date. And we have no loans. Those are loans turned to grants. Touch wood. And thanks to the hard work of our small team led by Lauren Frost, and the Impact Investing Committee, led by our board member, John Fisher. I have the true pleasure of working with a small but mighty staff team of 39 incredible professionals who each care deeply about what they do for community. Here are most of them. Some are missing. They were working too hard to make the photo. Now, supporting staff and the board to pivot quickly to remote work and ensuring staff well-being during a pandemic has been one of our priorities, like it has been for all of you. I give a lot of credit to all the staff for their efforts in making that shift so quickly and seamlessly, without hardly a glitch in our service to community. Kudos to Tracy Markle, who serves so capably the board governance function and who leads our HR function. Let me shift now to vital signs and a quick little short overview. You might have seen the launch about last week, and Taylor did a great job on CBC Radio. We did vital signs this year. Many organizations, community foundations right across Canada did not do vital signs this year because of the pandemic. They were busy and they had other priorities. We almost didn't do it, but then we did. And we did it because we thought it was critical at this time to understand how Calgarians are doing and feeling. It was a very stressful time last spring with the pandemic and anti-racism protests, and we thought it was important to take the pulse of Calgary. But we did it a bit differently, thanks to the wisdom of our communications team led by Taylor Berry. In the past year, we've had two survey methods, both supported by professional polling firms. One method is a broad citizen engagement survey where everyone is invited to participate and take the survey, and many of you took that survey in past years. The second method is a panel survey, statistically valid and representative of Calgary's demographics. This year, we only did the second, the panel survey, and that saved costs for us without sacrificing statistical validity. And this year, we added a race lens to the questions. And here are just a few things we learned. 82% of us believe racism towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color exists. 56% of us believe Calgarians are committed to anti-racism, equity, and inclusion. But if you are Indigenous, that belief drops down to 53%. And if you are Black, that belief drops down to 35%. There is much work to be done in reconciliation and anti-racism. A couple of years ago, I was in a learning session, and it was suggested there that I came from white power and privilege and enjoyed a society of white supremacy. I was rankled. My back went up. Defensive thoughts that crossed my mind were, I'm a humble Mennonite from the village. I value everyone. I've never been discriminatory. I've spent my career in service to community. That sounds so cruel. How can you say that? I have come to learn that white power and privilege means that I get to wake up in the morning and know that I do not have to fear that something will happen, a door will be closed or a barrier will be put up because of my skin color. And I will not have a negative judgment made about me because of my skin color. That's a powerful learning, and my back no longer goes up. I don't rankle, I hear. Calgary Foundation was established 65 years ago to address current urgent needs in community and future needs that could not be imagined by the founders. Reconciliation and anti-racism are current priority needs that were not imagined. These are not easy topics to delve into. We might make mistakes, but we are committed to this work and committed to learn from the mistakes we may make. This work is essential to achieve our vision, which is a community where everyone thrives. 3 years ago, we embarked in earnest on a reconciliation journey to shift our internal culture so that we could deepen our relationship with Indigenous communities. Thanks to the leadership of Tim Fox, we have made some progress. We are now embarking on another parallel journey in anti-racism and racial equity. It starts with listening and learning. And that's what we're offering to you next, the opportunity to hear from 3 women leaders in Calgary about their unique experience with race.
Eva, thank you very much. Thank you for that report, for all the activity of your teams, and also for that authentic and heartfelt commitment to the work at hand. This is not easy stuff, and we appreciate it, and we appreciate the time we're about to take to explore it. So thank you very much. Before introducing our panel, I just want to put a little bit more context around this discussion than Eva's already done. And I'd like to do that in a form of a quote. This is from Iman Fahmy from the Pillar Not-Profit Network. We're at this tipping point in history. Those of us who possess power and privilege are being called upon to act. We have the opportunity to collectively commit to allyship and the work of anti-oppression. And as allies, we recognize that this work is hard and it will take time. Only then will we see real change. So now, as Eva mentioned, I'd like to introduce three true change makers who've been leading this conversation for a long time in our community, and we're honored they've agreed to share their personal and professional experiences with us today. Let me introduce them one at a time. Elise Ahenkora is the Principal and Inclusion Strategist for a company based here in Calgary called Inclusion Factor. Welcome, Elise.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, great. That's great. We also have Leanne Ireland. She is the Executive Director of the Urban Society for Aboriginal Youth. USAY. Welcome, Leanne.
Thanks, Ken.
Great. And also joining us is Felicity Lettner. She's the Equity and Framework Coordinator for Community Wise Resource Center. Community Wise is a wonderful resource center based here in our city. Welcome, Felicity.
Hi, everyone.
Great. I'm gonna pose a question to all of you, but let me start with a preamble, and you can tell me if you agree. We seem to have a notion in Canada that some ways, when it comes to equity and inclusion and anti-racism, we're different. We're different than other parts of the world. We're different to our neighbors to the south, to Donald Trump's America, where we can look at things that have happened recently with George Floyd and others and say, that's not us, that's not Canada, that's not Calgary. And Canadians maybe have pretended a bit or become a little complacent. And yet, things have happened in our city, in our community, in our country. Joyce Echaquan in Quebec. What's going on with fishers in Nova Scotia and with the Mi'kmaq. There are some really interesting things that are happening that led me to believe that it's not so rosy where we find ourselves. I'd like you to react to that superiority complex almost that we've got around systemic racism. Elise, let me start with you. What goes through your mind when I say that?
What goes through my mind when you say that is that I think that people that do not believe there's systemic racism in Canada really don't understand the history of Canada. I think people at times still get shocked that our economic engines and the fabric of our country was started on slavery. That we particularly use free labor for certain people and created laws to justify how we could kind of feel good about using those people for free labor and treating them poorly. And so as a result of understanding the foundation of our country, it makes sense that the outcomes of this system has permeated into inequalities in our health pandemic, where we're seeing certain communities facing more impact than others. Our communities, so within our community sector and our public sector, we're seeing a low representation of the visible minority demographics that represent in Calgary. We're seeing in our legal system an overrepresentation of certain demographics in certain communities that are typically racialized. We're seeing in workplaces that leadership representation, as well as hiring, promotion, evaluation, seems to be skewed to individuals that are racialized. And there's data for this, right? I'm a firm believer that you're allowed to have your own opinion, but you're not allowed to have your own set of facts. And the facts demonstrate from a recent study by Northwestern University that Canada has higher levels of racial discrimination in hiring practices, more so than less.
I want to bring Leanne into this conversation because those facts show up with the work that you do every day, Leanne, with young people. You're an Indigenous woman working with Indigenous young people. How does that show up for you, that reality, that foundation that Elise is talking about? What does that look like in your world?
Well, as an Indigenous person, I think firstly I need to recognize my own privilege in that as an Anishinaabe woman living in Mohkinstsis in Calgary, I don't look Blackfoot, and I often live in this place of between two worlds. And when I exist in those two places, I get included in the white world and in the Indigenous world. And that gives me a unique perspective in seeing that people are, in fact, racist. The things that white people say to other white people when they think that you're part of their group. And I use white because, that's the dominant privileged culture, let's just say. It's not about race in that specific way, but as non-Indigenous white dominant culture will say, terrible things about Indigenous people, and they'll say racist things and derogatory things about Indigenous people, assuming I'm not part of that culture. And there's a recognition of my own privilege of being able to blend into those two worlds almost seamlessly, and in some cases be able to deny my Indigenous heritage and ancestry because of that. And so there's an innate privilege there that I think I need to recognize as a mixed race and as an Indigenous person. But Indigenous people experience racism every day. And I think it's different. We almost become desensitized to it, but it's different when it's on an individual level. I think, like Elise is saying, it's when you look to systems like police and healthcare and workforces and government to be your defender and your protector, as propaganda would have us believe. And yet those systems are in fact making you more vulnerable. It's the systemic racism, I think, that makes it worse for Indigenous people, because you're leaning on these places that are kind of betraying you.
We're going to talk about that vulnerability. I mean, I want to bring Felicity into this conversation. You're listening to what you've heard from Elise and Leanne. What are you thinking?
Well, coming back to your first question, I think what Elise and Leanne are saying is that Black, Indigenous, and racialized people have been talking about their experiences of racism in Canada since Canada was a thing. And so for us, there's a bit of impatience and urgency in addressing it. As someone who does anti-racism work, that wants to do the work on an individual and organizational level to address racism, there's a huge barrier before we can even get there. And that is getting people to believe that it exists. And so when I see that 82% of people believe that it's a thing, I feel like we're in a moment where there's an unprecedented amount of people that are willing to just acknowledge that reality. But for me, there's a huge gap still. And it's actually a research gap called the principal implementation gap, where people might believe that, but they are very unwilling. Levels of opposition will rise when we start talking about what the work needs to be done to address it. And so for me right now, if we're in a unique moment, I like to ask Canadians to sit with that and think about what are we going to do about it?
Well, let's talk about the sector that many people, there's hundreds of people watching us right now. We're very proud of that, but many of us have donated as donors. We've given our time and treasure and talent through the nonprofit sector. So let's talk about the nonprofit and charitable sector in our community. The sector seems to, there's an unbearable whiteness, some would say, to the sector, but it also seems to suffer from a bit of a white savior mentality. What are your thoughts on that? At least let's start with you. Are we contributing to the systemic racism just by the way we're showing up as a nonprofit community?
It depends on what's happening within your organization, but most certainly, as an individual yourself, are you framing individuals, the racialized people you want to help, in a certain box? I myself, I'm racialized, I'm a Black woman. When engaging in the nonprofit sector, I would often come across barriers because I did not fit into the small box of what someone saw of what a Black woman was. And in fact, it intimidated folks because at times I'd have maybe equal or more credentials as a person trying to support me. And I maybe wouldn't even be in a position necessarily needing support. And so I think it's worth checking your systems, really understanding what the biases are. And then of course, as an individual yourself, ask yourself, you most certainly are biased because we have a brain, you have a bias. Ask yourself when you're engaging with racialized communities, are you engaging with them in such a way where you are only engaging with racialized people that fit into your preconceived box of what a Black person is, what an Indigenous person is, what a racialized person is, because it shows up in work where you're interrupted, it shows up where you're passed by promotions, it shows up in your evaluations, it shows up statistically. So absolutely, there's a white savior complex, as well as a need to redefine what the talent looks like of racialized communities.
This is tough stuff, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. Leanne, in preparing for this conversation, you and I talked about how you need to frame support. When you're looking for support from the community for the work you do, that's not the easiest thing because of the way you're expected to do it. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so, often when you're filling out proposals to get funding, they always ask you, why do you need this? Tell us essentially how crappy your community is and how vulnerable they are and how many negative statistics are facing them. And as an Indigenous woman who works with amazing, brilliant, talented Indigenous people in our community, I'm constantly writing these things that are like, our people suck. We don't contribute to Canadian society. And I feel like that ongoing narrative where we need to prove to non-Indigenous people that we don't contribute actually leads to the prevalence of systemic racism. It's this narrative that Indigenous people don't contribute. They need white and non-Indigenous people to step in and save them and to rescue them from all of their vulnerabilities. And that's just not my lived experience. My lived experience is that we have amazing, talented humans that are Indigenous that require opportunity. And so it's very draining on me. I find myself filling out these applications and just describing all of these horrible traits and qualities and statistics about Indigenous people, knowing that non-Indigenous people are going to read them. And then it kind of informs and shores up their kind of bias that we were talking about, that bias that they believe about what is the stereotypical Indigenous person. Here's a talented Indigenous person saying that Indigenous people don't contribute.
And then things perpetuate.
And it's perpetuating that narrative that it's okay and it's acceptable to treat us in a way as if we don't have value.
Felicity, I know in your practice, I took some training with you, some anti-racism and unconscious bias training through the Calgary Foundation. It was really, really instrumental in me rethinking as a volunteer how we approach things. Given what you've just heard from Elise and Leanne, what are some of the tools? I know your training is hours long and amazingly rich, but what are some of the things that you would pull on to help the sector understand what it's doing and how to do it better?
There are so many tools and strategies, again, that we can work with. But I feel like when I work with organizations, I often encounter in the leadership, often white leadership, executive directors, leadership teams, and board of directors, a willingness to hear about those strategies, but an unwillingness to overcome their fear in actually doing something about it. I get a lot of hand wringing. I kind of describe it as an impenetrability that is really like a telltale sign of what is called white fragility. Robin DiAngelo's definition is that it's an intolerance to sort of any level of racial tension. And so for me, a lot of the questions revolve around less about the strategies, but more about what are you afraid of? What do you feel like you have to lose? Are you afraid of getting it wrong? And the opposite of being fragile is not being resilient or robust in the face of those things, because that just means you recover to where you are, you kind of stay the same. It's more growing as a result of those challenges, those conflicts, and those tensions. And so what I'd like to see more from the white leadership in the sector is a porousness, I think, to what Leanne just said and what Elise just said, and let that sit and move into action from a place of sort of intrinsic motivation, just knowing that it's the right thing to do.
I wanted to, Elise, I'm going to put a quote to you from you. You said you are constantly redefining someone's notion of what a BIPOC, a Black, Indigenous, or person of color woman is. How does that show up in your life? What is that from a personal standpoint? And share as much as you want here on this. What does that look like for you day to day?
So what that looks like for me day to day is combating stereotypes from a gender, race, and then other identities that I possess standpoint. So in my time in the public sector, that could look like being invited to a board to be approached by a board member saying, congratulations on joining your first board, when it's actually, in fact, my 7th board. There's obvious assumptions when looking at me that I represent a certain value. And oftentimes it's much lower than the actual value I represent. And when speaking to other women of color through Inclusion Factor or through my nonprofit with She Meets, that experience is not unique to myself. It's actually quite a common women of color experience, specifically within the nonprofit sector. it seems like within the nonprofit sector, there seems to be very biased indications of excellence. And so as a result, what it shows up in is microaggressions being cut off in meetings, being overlooked for promotions. It shows up in a variety of different microaggressions in your workday. An actionable recommendation for individuals is to really understand their biases, even if they feel really well-intentioned and woke and really in touch with what DEI is. When you encounter racialized people that maybe exceed the bias you have, address that bias and realize that, one, you have that bias, and two, recognize the talent that they can contribute to your organization.
We're going to be talking to a panel of people listening and sort of absorbing and then reacting to what you say in just a minute. But Leanne, you talked to me about taking some of the youth you do to the mall or to somewhere in the community. Tell me what that's like, and hold on to your hats, people. This is tough to hear.
So we have a youth group, an Indigenous youth group that meets on Wednesday night, and we meet at a particular mall in the city, or we used to. And as you know, some of our kids, they're tall, they're big, Indigenous men. And I think that's very scary for non-Indigenous people. And as our group grew, the interactions with the security got worse at the mall. And so we used to meet at a certain entrance, and then we would go about and do our activities. Our activities would be amazing things like looking for traditional medicines or meeting with an elder or going to mini golf. Like, these are kids that are in high school, you know? And so they would call the security on us almost every single week. They'd say that we were stealing, that we were being disruptive, that whatever. And then they would call the Calgary police on us, and the anti-gang suppression unit would show up and try and ban us from the mall. Were very aggressive with us, would sometimes like take our IDs and do different weird things. And despite showing them a card and being like, we're just a youth group, we would almost always get kicked out. And we started filming them, and then they started banning us from the mall. So now our Indigenous youth group has to meet on the street away from the mall, so that because we're now banned. This is more than microaggressions when you hear what you've just said. There's some really good commentary generating at #VitalCityYYC and also on the Hop-In chat if people want to share their thoughts on what you're hearing. But Felicity, before I sort of switch gears to end us off, when you hear what you're hearing, and you know that part of your professional obligation, but also your obligation as a person, is to help try to change this. We can't fix it all tonight. What's one piece of solid takeaway advice that you can give to the people listening, the people who brought their best selves to this conversation and want to make a change? What can they do to make that start or make a continuing effort?
Yeah, it's a complex answer to that question, but what I've been telling people is to really just center the experiences of the Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in their life, in the stakeholders in their community, to not just listen to what those experiences are, but to trust them. I think that's like a really big and important thing, and to trust that the recommendations they make for your organizations to, you know, how they should change, those are the things that we need to be working towards. And so for me, so much of that is about relationship building. It may be repairing relationships where they are broken, strengthening racial relationships where they may exist, and taking action together. So it's a hard thing to just put in a point on, but there's a lot of like learning and growth that can come from that. I think that's the promise of all this work, is that anti-racism benefits everyone. We are all suffering under conditions of white supremacy, and we can all benefit from dismantling it.
Leanne, what would our community benefit if a change was made, especially for those youth that you serve? Where would we benefit? Because I imagine the upside is huge.
Yeah, like what could people do? I think people could avoid this whole idea that we should encourage our kids to be colorblind. I think we should talk about diversity and race and difference, and then teach tolerance of difference and acceptance of difference. I always say I'd rather people hate me because of my personality than because of my race. And so I think the goal is to like not teach your kids that they should just avoid race conversations or race difference, but that we should embrace race difference. And and have conversations about it without being fearful that you'll be a racist. I think sometimes ignoring race almost makes it more racist.
A hopeful note. Elise, you've built a business around this. You're not messing around. This is something that can change, and you've actually built a curriculum, for lack of a better term. Just give us a sense of what that looks like and why that's important to actually take a step. You don't just talk about it.
For sure. I think it's worth just acknowledging that systemic racism is real and really equipping yourself with the online data, the plethora of online data that demonstrates how systemic racism impacts workplaces, communities, legal systems, healthcare, whatever it may be. But I think having a firm understanding of that is really kind of one of the steps. And truthfully, it's hard to kind of compile these steps because ultimately the outcome you want to create is that your employees, your stakeholders, they feel like they belong and respected. That's it, really. And so one, it starts with yourself. I think it's hard to be an optimist in my workplace if I'm not an optimist in my life. It's hard to be clean at work if I'm not clean as an individual. So as an individual self, taking off your CEO hat, your nonprofit hat, whatever it may be, as an individual, understand the commercial value and the intrinsic value of DEI and how systemic racism impacts your workplace. Understand you have biases and that they are impacting your decision-making right now. Because if you have a brain, you have biases. We take 11 million bits of information in per minute. We're only conscious of 40 of it. So as a result, you have biases. Acknowledge it, and really, secondly, address the workplace systems where those biases come in. I worked at places where there were beer fit tests when hiring people. Or is this someone that I could talk with after work? So it was a culture fit kind of assessment that was done subjectively when hiring people, as opposed to having a set criteria. These are the type of systemic barriers that definitely create barriers for people advancing in the workplace. So check in with your recruitment, your hiring, your engagement, your promotion. It's not about being nice to the Black person down the hall. It's about having systems, policies, and procedures in place that reinforce inclusive leadership behaviors.
What a powerful conversation. My thanks. Elise, Leanne, Thalassy, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. I know that the foundation will be giving more resources. And of course, right now, we're going to bring in some other voices to the conversation who've been sitting and listening. And we're going to just give them a couple of minutes each because we want to finish close to time here, but we're going to let them sort of react to what they've heard. Let me introduce I'll introduce the whole panel and then we'll hear from them one at a time. We're lucky to be joined by Vipassana Nangal. She's a member of the Calgary Foundation's Youth Council. Welcome, high school student, nice to see you. Sarah Steppa is the member of the STRIDE, a Calgary Foundation program that supports active citizenship. She's also works for a wonderful organization called Parks Foundation Calgary. Welcome, Sarah. We've got George Damien, a Calgary Foundation fund holder and donor. So he is one of those philanthropists that has invested through the foundation into the community, and I'm sure was listening very well. Eva Friesen, of course, you've met her already, our president and CEO at the foundation. And then John Fisher, a Calgary Foundation board member, and he's also the director of the Niskum Center at MRU, Mount Royal University, about student success in the Indigenous community and really raising up understanding around Indigenous ways of being. Welcome to all of you. I am going to start with our high schooler. Vipassana, you've been listening. You've got a couple of minutes. Tell me what you heard.
Of course. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for the Calgary Foundation for inviting me onto this event. It's definitely been a very enlightening experience. As you mentioned earlier, Ken, these have been very difficult and unprecedented times. And I know everyone's very tired of hearing that, but it's true. They have been very, very difficult. And I think to some extent, things have also become very divisive and fragmented in nature. But amidst all of this turmoil that's been experienced by different groups and communities, like the stories that we've heard, it's been so enlightening to see the work that is actually being done within our community, because I don't think that's amplified enough, that there are still people who are really vouching for the rights and acting as allies to communities that have been systematically oppressed. And as somebody who is very young, I think it's such a good example for how we really should be dealing with a lot of these issues. And with all of that being said, I also know that these issues that are being tackled and reflected upon are not simple issues. Like again, like hearing all of those stories and people's experience in both the workplace and experience as youth, Indigenous youth, it really just makes you think that a lot of systematic issues, they've been sewn into the fabric of the society in which we conduct ourselves in. And that's a little bit scary. But once again, hearing people and hearing the work that they've been doing it's been a very relieving experience, to say the least. And it's been, above all, very, very wonderful to see and watch a dialogue unfold, because I don't think that happens as much as it should. So,
Vipassana, I mean, you're giving kudos to the work that's happening around you, but I think it's the young people in our community that are actually leading the way, I'd argue. Sarah, you've been listening intently to everything that's happened. What's going through your mind?
So many things. I'd like to echo Vipassana and just be thankful for participating on this and hearing some of these perspectives. I'd like to sort of build a little bit on the concept of white fragility. That's something that sort of was a new term for me this year, that really learning what that meant. And Thusali talked about it and how it's really based around what are we afraid of? And I liked her comment of the opposite of fragility is not resiliency, but actually growth and learning, and how there's a lot of opportunity for us as we are aware of our own biases, as we start learning these new terms, we actually acknowledge that racism exists, that we can start to learn and grow and be better as individuals, as organizations, as leaders, whatever that might look like for who we are. Something I really notice sort of in my interactions or in my relationships is that people, they want to stay in their comfortable space. So when they're comfortable, it's the same, or people look the same, they think the same, and therefore they feel safe. When they're uncomfortable or they're sitting in discomfort, they then are fearful. They start to feel afraid, and then they put up their backs and they feel like they have to defend themselves. And I'm curious, or would challenge people maybe listening today, is instead of fearing change or fearing difference, trying to embrace that or explore that a little bit more and see how we can learn from that. And it's okay that people are different. You don't always have to agree, but understanding or being aware of others' opinions can really make a big difference. So I challenge people to think about that and really ask, what are we afraid of?
Great question. George, you got a couple of minutes here. Give us a sense of, so much has been said, so much has probably been felt. What are you thinking?
Yeah, having all the feels, as they say. First of all, I want to thank the Calgary Foundation, Eva and Elizabeth, and the entire team for really not shying away from this. One thing that really resonated with me was Eva's comments around, being rankled and having her back against the wall. I think that's very common for everyone. And that's not just around race, it can be around gender or any number of issues. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that. For me, I try and be a pragmatist, both as a donor and in the community. I'm interested in making change, not necessarily in being right. And I think that, to the white people among us, this is not about the blame game. This is not about saying that you are wrong and that someone with ethnicity or a member of the BIPOC community is right. I think, to your question earlier about what should we do or how can we make change, I think the most powerful way is to remain curious. When you hear something, when it rubs you the wrong way, when you think, I'm not a racist, so that doesn't apply to me, the conversation around biases, the reality is that we all have biases. Many of them are things that we didn't adopt consciously, but they inform the way that we interact, the people we interact with, and the way we view the world. And so I think that if people can remain curious and at least be open to rethinking things, that's huge. The other thing I would mention is, when Leanne was talking about, that group and just being tall and the views that people will have of you, I think that curiosity also extends to looking at it from that other person's point of view. If you're a teenager, you don't think that you're a menacing figure, right? And yet all the time through your eyes, you might see people who are giving you those kinds of looks or who are moving to the other side or who are avoiding you. If you see that every day, that's going to affect you deeply. And so again, if you have the privilege of not feeling that way, then it really behooves you, I think, to take that responsibility, to take that power and use it for good. And I would maybe just kind of, while I'm on this, raise two quotes that I think are very relevant. And one is the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, where he says that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I really do believe that. And then the other one is from Alice Walker, which is the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. I think that, as a donor, I come from a place of privilege. As a man, I come from a place of privilege, and there's probably any number of lenses that contribute to that. And I think that I have to take ownership for that, and I would challenge other people to do the same and really try and affect change here.
Thanks, George. John, I'll give Eva the last word in a moment, but John, you work with Indigenous young people. You're an Indigenous